Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's webinar. Before we get started, please make sure to follow the steps that you see on the screen. We can make sure to make sure that we hear you by clicking on the chat bubble. A little box will pop up, and you'll be able to type any questions or any comments that you'd like to share throughout the course of the webinar. Please make sure that you're able to see and hear us clearly by joining on your phone, tablet, or desktop, and by dialing in if you choose to do so by using the phone number and the conference ID that was provided for you. Your facilitators for this afternoon's webinar are Dee Kalar, Paige Carbone, Taryn Katusian, and Lisa Galasso, your alumni engagement team. Dee could not be with us this evening, but we hope that Dee is doing well. And we'd like to introduce Betty Duggan, class of 1975, for her webinar, How to Communicate with Confidence. Betty Duggan is the director of the New York City Medical Reserve Corps for the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. She holds a BA in psychology and sociology from St. Joseph's College. She is a lifelong New Yorker. Betty has had an extensive background in volunteer management. Prior to coming to the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, Betty was the director of volunteer and community programs at the Medicare Rights Center, where she managed a consumer hotline, was the principal trainer, and managed over 500 volunteers. As manager of the New York City Medical Reserve Corps, Betty has the privilege of working with nearly 9,500 highly skilled healthcare professionals who agree to respond in the event of a disaster or emergency in New York City and to assist with public health initiatives. Betty, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we'd love to hear your webinar presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about how to build confidence in yourself, communicating your ideas, tailoring your message, planning your opening remarks, and the art of asking and answering questions. So you may or may not know that public speaking is the #1 phobia. It comes before fear of death, fear of spiders, fear of darkness, and fear of heights. And one of the things we're going to talk about today is how you manage that. You're not alone. Lots of people feel this way if you have a terrible fear of public speaking. And we'll talk about how you may be able to overcome that. So confidence. And when we talk about confidence in this sense, we're talking about personal confidence. First of all, ask yourself, what gives you confidence? Does wearing a special outfit make you feel good about yourself? Do you have a good luck charm you like to keep in your pocket? Do you have a mantra? Do you remember that Stuart Smiley character on Saturday Night Live? I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. There's a way of thinking about yourself that inspires confidence. One way is maybe having an affirmation. On my desk, I have a Mother Teresa affirmation that I read every morning, and it says, "We cannot do great things. We can only do small things with great love." And that's the way I inspire myself to have confidence and go out to the world and present information that I have. And the other idea is to fake it till you make it. That idea that even if you don't feel confident, if you present yourself as confident, people will believe that you're a confident person and you'll start to feel it yourself. So in both written and oral presentations, the keys to confidence are mastery of the information, planning, and practice, 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 practice. Even the most seasoned speaker gets nervous sometimes, and it's not enough to know your material backward and forward, inside out and upside down. You need to know more about your topic than is actually in your presentation, so that you feel like you have mastery of the information and confidence about it. In presentations, your PowerPoint is a roadmap. It's not a script. So when you do a presentation, you shouldn't be just reading what's off the slides. That's just your roadmap to keep you going in the right direction. And in written work, you should have an outline, even if in the end it's not included in the paper, because it also is a roadmap to keep you going in the right direction and to set steps along the way that help you get to the end that you want to get to. So some things you should know, and you probably do know some of these already, but written and spoken language are not the same. Written language is more formal. Spoken language uses colloquialisms or words that we use in everyday speaking. Most people only hear about 1 out of every 10 words you speak. So What does that say to you? That means you have to repeat the important things the messaging over and over. Most people need to hear information 22 times before they understand and act on it. Again, restate your main message in different ways, because different people learn in different ways, and use concrete examples. So sometimes people may not understand the language you use, but they will understand concrete examples, and it makes it more real for people. So what's the purpose of presentation and papers? The purpose is communicating ideas. It doesn't matter how attractive the paper is or how well you dress for a presentation. The ideas are the important part. So, you can put beautiful covers on your papers, you can have wonderful photographs in your papers, but it's the concepts and ideas that are the important part. So written communication has different rules from oral presentations. There's always an assigned format. It tends to be written in more formal language. You have to make sure you define terms. You're not going to be able to see a person's face, so you won't be able to know if they don't understand things. So you have to be very clear. You get to put acronyms and that kind of thing in footnotes and endnotes, so that makes it easier in some ways of communicating. When you're writing, if you're writing for a publication, they usually have specific rules about how you manage a paper. If you're writing for a class, the professor generally has specific rules. And most papers have word or page limits. Written communication. You should share your paper with peers or somebody who can review your paper before you hand it in, so that you make sure that it's clear. Use a plagiarism text. A good one, check. A good one is Q-text, because be sure that the publisher or the teacher that you're handing this into is going to check for plagiarism. And sometimes plagiarism is not deliberate. You have an idea in your head, something that you've heard over and over again, and you include it in your presentation not realizing it should be in quotes. So it's really important to do that. You should write multiple drafts. And you should step away from your paper or your presentation, give your brain a little rest, and then go back to it and review it again. And always, always, always don't wait till the last minute, because that's when you start to have a lot of stress and a lack of confidence. So presenting your paper is a presentation, right? You're going to get up and talk to your class about it. Don't read at the audience. Allow for questions and discussion. If you read at the audience, people are not going to listen to you. So you want to communicate your ideas. You can simplify or shorten what you want to say. It doesn't have to be exactly what's in your paper. The idea is to communicate the main ideas, not to read the paper to people. So some keys to giving effective presentations. The first is know your subject material, inside and out, upside down and right side up. The more you know, the easier it is to answer questions. Stick to the key points. It's very important to identify the 3 to 5 most important things you want people to learn and repeat them multiple times. Convey enthusiasm and, if possible, humor. And I can't say this enough. Rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. Rehearse in front of friends. Reread your presentation multiple times so that it's a part of you. And again, use examples and illustrations. The more colorful your ideas and suggestions and examples are, the more your audience is going to identify with what you're saying. So here are some keys to an effective presentation. Watch the time. Start and finish on time. It's okay to start late. I often say, and I'll say this to the people in the audience, I'm going to wait 5 minutes, give people a 5-minute grace period to get here. But even if you start 5 minutes late, you have to end on time or before. Because at 5 minutes before your presentation is over, people are starting to get up and leave their room. And you want them to hear your whole message. Ensure that your materials are culturally relevant. Don't use examples so far out of your audience's experience that your audience won't understand what you mean. Give your audience a chance to express their thoughts. Dialogue between a speaker and the audience can create engagement, but you have to control the conversation. It can derail your message if it goes on too long. And there's always somebody who wants to be the center of attention, who wants to hijack your presentation. So you need to think about how you're going to manage that. And people won't always agree with you. Respect your audience's opinions, but make sure that they understand that your information is coming from a place of knowledge. That it's not an opinion, it's knowledge-based. Answer questions directly and listen for concerns or confusion. You can hear it in the room. People don't understand what you're talking about. All of a sudden you hear kind of a murmur going on. And it's when you hear that happen, you have to stop and say, it sounds like something I said is confusing you. Can somebody raise their hand and tell me what's going on? How can I help you to understand this better? If you ignore it, then people are going to talk to each other and not listen to what you have to say. So what obstacles might you encounter when you give a presentation? Sometimes people come into a presentation with myths and misinformation in their mind. I'll give you an example. We do a lot of presentations on radiation poisoning and radiation response. And the first thing I do when I do this is I talk about that whole idea of the Incredible Hulk. You know, people have that notion that if you get exposed to radiation, you're going to blow up and turn green. And that's not really what happens. But if you think you're going to blow up and turn green, you're not going to be open to the idea of helping people who have radiation poisoning. So that's kind of a good example of a myth that I want to get people to put aside before I start talking about radiation. Audiences have fears and concerns. So if you can address them ahead of time, that will make it easier for people to listen to what you have to say. Avoid using acronyms without explaining them. So in my business, I do a lot of disaster response. We hear the CDC, the SNS, OEPR, ASPR, ICS, EOC. If somebody goes into a presentation, they don't know what all those things are, they're trying to puzzle that out instead of listening to your message. So you should avoid using complex terms or jargon, but if you need to use a complex term, you have to take a minute to define it. So how will you answer difficult questions? When you're preparing your presentation, think about the questions your audience might have. Be prepared to answer generic, if not specific, answers for these questions. For example, if somebody asked me, how many nurses do I have in the Medical Reserve Corps? It's a big group for me. I might not be able to say it's 2,300, probably around that. But I could say it's about 25% of my members, which is a more general answer. But I don't want to make things up or guess. And I might say, I think it's around 2,200, it's 25%, but I'll get back to you. Let's talk afterwards. Admit it when you don't know an answer. We're all tempted. We feel like we're in front of the room and we're the expert, and it looks bad if you don't know the answer. Kind of the way I manage when somebody asks me a question and I don't know the answer, I'll say, hey, that's an excellent question. No one's ever asked me that before. Let's touch base after the presentation. I'll take your contact information. I'll find out the information and get back to you. You don't lose face by doing that, but you should never, ever make up information because a lot of times people are depending on the information you give out to make decisions. You should also have a strategy for managing the person trying to take over the meeting. There's almost always someone who wants to derail the presentation to promote their own agenda. You should plan on that. Be prepared to say, that's interesting, but off topic. Come see me after the presentation to discuss this. Or you could say, let's let someone else speak. Or you could say, let's hear from someone else who hasn't had a chance to speak yet. There are lots of strategies for managing people who are trying to dominate a presentation, but you have to think about it ahead of time because it can make you flustered in the moment if you haven't prepared for that. So when you're giving presentations, how do you communicate your ideas? The first is, of course, to use spoken, not written language. Even if you are giving a presentation on a paper you've written, you're You're not using the written language that's in the paper. You're basically translating it into spoken language. Use concrete and colorful language. Examples always, always, always help people to understand your ideas. Use language appropriate for your audience. You know, the language you're going to use if you're giving a presentation to elementary school kids is going to be completely different than you're giving a presentation to a room full of doctors. And you should be aware of that. And ask questions when you are invited to speak. Ask questions about who's going to be in the audience so you know how to prepare for that. Avoid jargon, technical terms, or vague expressions. And again, speak directly to your audience. If your head is down, you're reading from a paper, or you're only looking at the slides, you're not engaging your audience, and they are not going to listen to what you have to say. So be aware of your mannerisms. Be aware of your movements and gestures, your speech, your eye contact, and your voice. Some examples of gestures that may detract from your presentation are waving your hands wildly. Gestures shouldn't distract you from your message, or walking around so much that it's hard for the audience to follow you, or distract from the slides. And I'll give you an example. I once gave a presentation in Georgia, and there were 3 people on the stage. It was me, a Harvard professor, and another person. And the Harvard professor went first. And he stood at the podium, and he put his hands in his pockets, and his pockets apparently were filled with change. And he jangled that change through his whole presentation. Jangling the change. He also sort of draped himself over the podium. And his mannerisms were so distracting, I don't think anybody heard anything he said. It was like he was a really smart guy, and he had a really good message. But he was so distracting in his mannerisms that you couldn't pay attention to him. Be careful of your speech. Avoid filler words like, you know, and like. And that happens when your brain is moving faster than your mouth. So the one way to help avoid that is when you just feel yourself going that way, take a breath. Pause. It's okay to pause in the middle of your presentation, and it sounds much more professional than, I don't know, you know, like. And if that's something that you think you do, that you use filler words, make sure you tape your presentation and listen to it. Then you can see the filler words you use and kind of try to be more aware of it. And you're never going to eliminate it 100%. Everybody kind of does a little of that, just like I did, kind of. So, but it's good to be aware of it and try to minimize it. Make eye contact with your audience. It's okay to kind of, if you're in a big room with a lot of people, kind of try to look into the middle space so that people feel like you're engaged and you're looking at them. It's very important. And the last thing is voice. There are 3 things about voice that you have to pay attention to: pitch, volume, and timing. So pitch is high or low, and when you're nervous, your voice pitch actually goes up. So be aware of that, because high pitch is the first thing people lose if they have a hearing loss. It's harder for people to hear something that's high pitched. The second is volume. You need to speak loud enough for people to hear you. And if you're using a microphone, you need to learn how to use it, because people want to hear what you have to say, but they don't want to hear reverb on the mic. It's very distracting and annoying. And timing. Use timing to be effective part of your speech. So, for example, if there was something that I wanted to really emphasize, I might say, the use of timing is very important. And space, pause. Because a pause will emphasize the next thing you're going to say. And then the last thing is slow down. New Yorkers talk very quickly. And when you're nervous, you talk more quickly still. So one thing I recommend to my staff when they're going out to give a presentation, and I'll give it to them as a present, is an index card that just says slow down. Have them put it on the podium, and they can look at that and remind themselves to slow down their speaking. Because you don't want to speak so quickly that people don't understand you. So plan your opening remarks. Grab your audience attention at the very start of your presentation. So I'll give you an example. I'll give you a couple examples. First is I gave a presentation in Manhattan, and it was a few years ago. I was walking through Bryant Park on the way to the place I was giving the presentation. I think it was the Alzheimer's Association. And when I walked through Bryant Park, it was early in the morning, and Ringo Starr was there with the all-star band playing. It was like one of these serendipitous New York moments. But it made me so happy. And I went to this place, and I said, I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really happy to be a New Yorker. I just walked through Bryant Park and saw Ringo Starr. And everyone could identify with that. That was a New York moment. People were like, oh, yeah, it's so cool, They were paying attention to me as a person then. Tell them who you are and why you're glad to be presenting to them. And then ask them a question to engage them. So when I go out to talk about disaster response, especially in New York City, I'll start with a question. Were you in New York City on 9/11? And I'll raise my hand. And then everybody in the audience who was here on 9/11 raises their hands. And then I talk about, how that basically changed our worldview forever. And this is why disaster response is so important. But it makes it a very personal thing because people immediately think about, where was I on 9/11? And especially for people who were in New York on 9/11, that was a powerful time. So that's just an example of how you might ask a question to engage them. I asked a question. It was relevant to their lives. It gave them an opportunity to interact because they raised their hand. So that's just one example of how to do that. But you need to think about who you are and what works for you. You might have a very different approach, but you definitely have to introduce yourself and say why you're there and why you're glad to be there. If you can tell a little joke, that's great. I'm not good at jokes. I can never remember the punchlines. But for other people, it works really, really well. I can't say enough about rehearsing. You should do a full run-through of your presentation out loud in front of a mirror or in front of friends. In front of a mirror actually gives you a chance to explore your gestures and facial expressions and to reinforce your messages. So that's really helpful. But your friends can give you feedback too. And one of the things that rehearsing does is it tells you how long your presentation actually takes. Because when you're reading it visually, you can read much quicker with your eyes than you can when you're reading out loud. So you need to have a sense of what the timing is. You need to check on your expressions, your facial expressions. You can record it to check for those speech things like or and like. And I would say rehearse, 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 rehearse. You should be able to give the presentation by only glancing occasionally on your notes. You shouldn't be having to rely on your notes very heavily because you don't know the material. If you lost your notes on the way to the presentation, could you still give the presentation? If you rehearsed enough, you should be able to do so. And knowing your information inside and out like that, that's the way to create confidence. That's when you feel, okay, I know this, I own this, I can do this, I'm successful. Remember, your notes, your PowerPoint is just a roadmap. And if you're not that familiar with PowerPoint, remember that on every page there's a thing called Notes. You can open the view to Notes, and you can write the stuff that you don't want the audience to see. You can write on the bottom of the page so that you have the slide and then underneath the things that you want to emphasize. It's a very good way of setting up presentations, and depending on the version of PowerPoint you're using, in some versions you actually see the notes underneath on a little side screen. So using the notes section will really help you to organize your thoughts and your ideas, and also to keep your presentation moving. Use AV equipment effectively. When you're going to give a presentation, walk around the room. Can everyone see the AV? Is the writing on the slides large enough? My big pet peeve is people who put up slides with so many words that you can't read any of them, but they're very proud that they put all this information on their slide. PowerPoint is a roadmap. It's not every word that you want people to hear. That goes in your note pages. Practice using the equipment. There's no bigger way to look like you don't know what you're doing if you can't open the PowerPoint or you can't move the slides along. And take advantage of the in-house AV technicians. A lot of places will have an AV person come to help you set up, especially if you're going to be projecting your slides. They'll help you set that up. I always ask them to make sure to test if I'm going to do a video, make sure the video works, make sure the sound works. All of that is really important in having a professional presentation. You can be a genius and know everything about your topic, but you need to have these things in place so that you have a professional presentation. I want to talk about asking questions, because part of giving a good presentation is having a back and forth two-way communication with your audience. So you want to make sure they're understanding what you're saying. So you want to ask questions. Use open questions. So not questions like that the answer is yes or no, but questions where people can think about it. Direct your questions to the whole audience. If it seems like nobody's raising their hands, no one seems to understand what your question is, or sometimes it takes a little while for people to get the nerve to raise their hands, rephrase the question, or ask for a personal experience if no one answers. Don't let one or two participants dominate. Remember, you want this to be a learning experience for the whole group, not just for one person. And then if you're doing questions, you need to think about how you want to format that. Do you want people to raise their hands throughout the whole presentation? Is it okay for them to interrupt you because they don't understand? Or do you want to hold all the questions to the end? So there are pluses and minuses to that. If people are raising their hands in the middle of the presentation, sometimes it makes the presentation go long. You don't get to give out all the information you have. The flip side of that is if you ask people to wait till the end of the presentation, then sometimes people are so focused on that one question they want to ask that they don't hear anything else you have to say. So one way to manage that is to give out index cards or papers and pens and say, if you have a question, write it down. We're holding all our questions to the end. And that way the person can write down their question and then continue to listen and not have to say, I have to remember this question. It's really important. I want to be able to ask this question. Because they've got it written down, they can ask it later. So answering questions. Very important. The first thing is to repeat the question. And you'll hear this. If you don't do this, people are going to yell at you. They're going to say, repeat the question. I didn't hear that. What did they say? So just automatically, someone asks a question, before you answer it, you repeat the question. Sometimes you're not going to know what the question means. It's okay to say, okay, you rephrase that. I'm not really sure what you mean, or ask for clarification, or did you mean? Because you want to make sure that what you're answering is the question that's asked. Be succinct. Be brief, right? The question and the answer period is not for more lectures. They should be short, simple answers. And don't make up information. I can't say this enough. If you don't know the answer, say, great question. I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I'll look it up and get back to you. Don't guess. Sometimes the information you're giving out is important to people's lives, and if you give them the wrong information, they could make bad decisions. So some ways to help your participants learn. First of all, if you're giving handouts are not like something for people to take notes of. You're giving out things because you want them to read them. So before you start your presentation, you should review all the handouts and say, I'm giving you this page that has all these contacts you can reach out to. I'm giving you this page with definitions. Maybe if you're using a lot of acronyms that you think your audience might not know, maybe you want to hand out a page with all the acronyms on them. But whatever pieces of paper you give out before you start speaking, explain what the handouts are and why you gave it to them. Stick to your key points. And remember, key points should be repeated at least twice, at least at the beginning and at least at the end. You can repeat them again in the middle, but the more times you say what your key points are, the more likely it is your audience is going to remember them. And I often say, here are the points I want you to learn about. That's what those beginning, what are we going to learn about today? Those are your key points. At the end, those are the things people should have learned about. You should stress relevant facts and allow your audience to use all their senses in any way that you can think. So have them write, have pictures, sing Kumbaya, whatever works. So I'm going to stop. Go forth and present. I hope this helps a little bit in terms of thinking about how you give presentations with confidence, and we're going to take any questions that may be.
Thank you, Betty. That was fantastic. I know that I've learned a lot from your presentation, and I've been presenting for a long time, so that goes to show that even if you've presented for years or if you've maybe done a handful of presentations, there's always something you can do to tweak yourself, to take something in that you might not have known before. And as we're talking, I just wanted to let everyone know that if you have any questions, please feel free to use your chat box and actually type in any questions that you'd like to ask. We'll be giving them to Betty live during the webinar right now. And the first question is, do you recommend using humor in your presentations?
It depends on what you're presenting about. Mostly I would say yes. You know, people really connect with humor. I mean, if you're talking about a genocide, you're not going to use humor. But yeah, generally humor is good. And we had lots of, even in disaster response, we had lots of funny stories of things that happened. And we would tell our funny stories because sometimes it's better to laugh than to cry. So I think humor is really good if you can pull it off.
Thank you. I'd also just like to mention quickly as people are typing more questions, we know that some people had some issues hearing the audio for the presentation. We have fully recorded the presentation, so everyone who is registered will receive access to that recording. So if anybody didn't hear something or you want to go back and listen to something that you thought was really meaningful for you, you will be able to revisit that again. Here's another question. If you are a very nervous speaker, is it a good idea to type out the entire presentation? Parentheses, I love the note card idea.
I don't think it's a good idea to type out your entire presentation because then you're locked into one idea. I mean, you can type the whole thing out so that you can learn it, right? And you practice over and over and over and over again. I wouldn't bring a whole presentation written out to when I was giving a presentation because then you're going to be really tempted to just read it with your head down and not make any connection with the audience. I also think, you know, I guess people have different styles, but for me, to put the information in bullets is much easier to refer to than a full written out presentation. But I think that's a personal style thing, and you should try it a couple of different ways and see what works for you. But don't read at your audience. Please, please, please. They will not thank you for it.
Here's a fantastic question that I know I've always thought about. Someone says, what's the best advice if your technology does not cooperate?
Okay. I always tell people I'm a total Luddite, which is relevant, sort of true. I'm much better than I used to be. But if you have practiced, if you have planned your presentation, if you have, you know, I always print out my presentation with my note pages and bring it with me. You'll see I brought it today. Then you can give the presentation without visuals. And I always make a joke about, oh, okay, the AV's not working, so now you have to put up with me singing and dancing. But people generally are very sympathetic if they understand that you've been foiled by the technology, as long as you can continue with the presentation. So if you have your PowerPoint printed out with your note pages, you can still go along and give the presentation. And if you've rehearsed, a lot of times you can put that paper down, sing and dance, make it entertaining. You can encourage participation in different ways than visually by having the members of your audience do more discussion or ask them. I try to do my presentations more as questions. So I'll say, what do you know about go bags? Who has a go bag? Do you know what goes in it? You know, and let the answers come from the audience and then fill in whatever they don't know, because that makes people remember. You know, if they're developing a list of what goes in a go bag, they're much more likely to remember it than if I'm telling them. So that's what I would do. I would make sure I really know the presentation, and then if the AV doesn't work, you got to wing it.
Next question, are there different techniques you can recommend for a sitting presentation versus a standing presentation? And if you have a choice, which would you recommend?
Who's sitting and standing, the presenter or the audience?
So the question is, who is sitting or standing? Is the audience sitting or are you sitting? That would be the question. So if that person can type some follow-up, that would be great. And in the meantime, presenter is sitting.
Okay, I prefer to stand because I like to move a little. I'm also very short, so when I'm sitting, I feel like I'm almost disappearing. But if you have to sit or stand, I don't think it really matters as long as your information is clear. If you're a person who does big gestures, maybe sitting is better because it confines you a little. But I think the audience sees you better when you stand. Again, though, sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes it's not your thing. But I think either works well if you're well prepared.
Another question here. So when do you think people generally experience the most self-doubt and why? And I'm guessing this question is in context with presenting or public speaking.
I think a few things. I think people feel a lot of self-doubt and terror when they're going to present if they haven't prepared, if they're not ready. Sometimes it's because they've never had to do it before. They're inexperienced. And sometimes it's an unfamiliar situation, an unfamiliar place. I remember going out to Ohio to an Air Force base in the middle of nowhere. It took me hours to find the damn place. I was presenting to very high-level doctors, and I never get nervous at presentations. I was so terrified because I was out of my own environment. So that's something that plays into it. How would you make it better? For me, sometimes it's, dressing professionally because then I feel like a grown-up. Practicing, always practicing. And just using that mantra, whatever it is that you have that helps you get through things. But I don't think it's uncommon that people have moments of real terror when they come to give presentations. Deep breathing is something that really helps. Really take some deep breaths. That whole meditation thing, breathe in God, breathe out ego, whatever your mantra is to help you get in the mood, get in the place to present. And then you have to kind of let go of yourself and let the presentation run itself.
And I think, Betty, that's really the point. I think everyone in some way, shape, or form, regardless of how experienced you might be presenting, always experiences some level of nervousness or, like you said, might throw an in by accident or might forget something that they might have rehearsed. So you're all sort of in the same boat in that sense where, we're utilizing the skills that we have, but still knowing that we're human beings and that every once in a while we can make mistakes too. Thank you so much, Betty, for joining us today in our How-To webinar series presentation. The next installment of the webinar series will be How to Deliver Constructive Criticism on Tuesday, June 5th at 3 p.m., presented by Dawn Kidd, class of 2012. We also have additional webinars that we'll be sending you information about in the coming weeks so that you'll be able to register for this and any others. If you're interested in coming to our Spring Reunion weekend happening on April 12th to 15th, 2018, please feel free to visit our website and check out our website for registration information. If you have any ideas for future webinars, anything that you'd like to see us present that maybe you'd like to hear more about, please feel free to email us accordingly. Some more information here about our Spring Reunion. And lastly, Betty is part of our SJC Mentor Program, which means that Betty has volunteered her time willingly to work one-on-one with an individual who could be a current student or an alum of the college who's interested in maybe doing something that Betty's doing or gaining a skill from her or getting advice from her about her professional career and how she feels that she's done professionally. So SJC Mentor is our program that's available for students, staff, faculty, alumni, and pretty much anybody in the St. Joseph's College community. Alums do not have to be alums of the mentors do not have to be alums of the college if you're interested in joining. So if you're interested in more information about our SJC Mentor Program, feel free to visit our website at sjcny.edu/alumni/sjcmentor. And don't forget to check us out on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Google+ as well. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be sending you, like I mentioned, access to the audio for the presentation as well as the visuals. Thank you to those of you who might have had some issues with that, and thank you to Lisa for helping us troubleshoot. We really appreciate your patience and your time, and thank you and have a great day.